Welcome back to The Verdict Room, the channel where we break down the legal system's most jaw-dropping moments. Today, we're exploring something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, the legal loopholes that actually worked. We're talking about cases where criminals walked free on technicalities, where billion-dollar companies exploited fine print, and where one tiny mistake by prosecutors completely derailed entire cases. These aren't made-up stories. They're real court decisions that changed the law forever. So buckle up, because some of these loopholes are so crazy, you won't believe they held up in court. Let's start with a case that shocked the entire legal community and raised serious questions about our criminal justice system. In 1966, a man named Ernesto Miranda confessed to a brutal crime while in police custody, a kidnapping and rape case that seemed completely cut and dry. He had confessed, signed a statement, and the prosecution believed they had an airtight case. But here's where the loophole comes in. Miranda was never told of his right to remain silent or his right to an attorney. His defense team argued that this violation was a technicality that should invalidate everything. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a stunning decision, the justices agreed. The Supreme Court ruled that law enforcement had to inform suspects of their rights before interrogation, or any confession would be inadmissible in court. This single decision, based on a procedural technicality, freed Miranda and created what we now know as the Miranda rights. But here's the truly mind-blowing part. Miranda was later retried without his confession, convicted anyway, and served his time. The loophole didn't free him permanently, but it fundamentally changed how police operate in America. And that's the power of a legal loophole. It's not always about justice, but about procedure. Now let's jump to a completely different type of loophole that cost one company hundreds of millions of dollars. In the 1990s, a major cable television company had a contract dispute that seemed routine. The company had agreed to maintain a certain percentage of network infrastructure, but the contract had been hastily written with vague language. When the company failed to meet the standard, they argued that the contract never actually defined what maintain meant or which specific infrastructure was covered. The other party had to take them to court, and during discovery, something remarkable happened. A lawyer reviewing the contract found that the original agreement had a typographical error. A single paragraph was duplicated, but in slightly different terms. This created an internal contradiction that technically made the entire clause unenforceable. The company's legal team argued that because the contract was internally contradictory, they couldn't be held to an impossible standard. The court agreed. The ruling cost the other party millions in damages they could no longer claim, simply because of a typo. This case became a landmark example of why contract language matters, and why companies now spend enormous amounts of money on legal review before signing agreements. Let's talk about time itself, specifically how a statute of limitations became one of the most powerful legal loopholes. In 1987, a woman named Jennifer Thompson was brutally assaulted and raped, and she identified Ronald Cotton as her attacker. Cotton was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. But here's the twist: he actually wasn't the perpetrator. For years, the real attacker remained unknown, and Cotton maintained his innocence. The key loophole that eventually freed him was the statute of limitations on DNA evidence. Before DNA testing became available, states had passed various laws about how old a case could be before new evidence could be introduced. Cotton's case was so old that technically it fell into a gray area where new evidence tests might not be admissible. However, technological advancement and changing laws created an exception for DNA evidence. When testing finally occurred in 1995, 8 years after his conviction, it definitively proved Cotton's innocence. He was exonerated and released. The statute of limitations loophole almost prevented this justice. But the recognition that science had changed the game led to a reversal. This case demonstrates how loopholes can actually work against justice, but how the system can adapt. Now picture this scenario. Law enforcement is tracking a criminal's location by monitoring his cell phone GPS without a warrant. Seems reasonable in the age of technology and national security, right? Wrong, according to the Supreme Court. In the 2012 case of United States versus Jones, the FBI had placed a GPS tracking device on the vehicle of a man named Antoine Jones, who they suspected of drug trafficking. They tracked his location for 28 days without obtaining a warrant. The prosecution argued this was standard surveillance practice. But Jones's legal team raised an interesting argument. This constituted an illegal search under the Fourth Amendment. The Supreme Court had to decide whether physical tracking devices required warrants. In a stunning decision, the court ruled 5-4 that yes, placing a tracking device on someone's car without a warrant violated their Fourth Amendment rights. This loophole, based on property rights and privacy, freed Jones from what should have been an open and shut drug trafficking case. The government had all the evidence they needed, but because of how they obtained it, the case fell apart. The ruling forced law enforcement agencies across America to completely overhaul their surveillance practices and now requires warrants for GPS tracking. One legal technicality changed how an entire nation conducts criminal investigations. Let's explore one of the most misunderstood protections in American law: double jeopardy. The Fifth Amendment guarantees that you cannot be tried twice for the same crime. But there's a loophole that's absolutely wild. In 1992, a man named Rodney King was severely beaten by LAPD officers, and the beating was caught on video. It seemed like an open and shut case. State prosecutors charged the officers with assault. The trial occurred, the jury deliberated, and the officers were acquitted. The verdict shocked the nation and sparked the Los Angeles riots. But here's the loophole. Federal prosecutors then charged those exact same officers with civil rights violations. The Supreme Court had established that state and federal charges are technically different sovereigns, meaning double jeopardy doesn't apply. So the officers who were acquitted in state court were tried again in federal court for essentially the same actions. This time they were convicted. The loophole in double jeopardy protection, the dual sovereignty doctrine, allowed a second prosecution that would otherwise be illegal. This case shows how a legal technicality can actually lead to a different outcome in the name of federal oversight. Whether that's justice or exploitation of the system is still debated today. Finally, let's examine one of the most technical loopholes of all: the typo that invalidated a law. In 2015, a woman was charged with tax evasion under a federal statute that had been written decades earlier. Her defense team meticulously reviewed the law and discovered something that should have been caught immediately. The statute contained a typographical error. A word was misspelled in a way that technically changed the legal meaning of the statute. The court had to determine whether a misspelled word in a law actually invalidated the law itself. This wasn't a hypothetical question. There was real money and real jail time on the line. The judge examined the legislative history, the intent of lawmakers, and the actual wording of the statute. In a narrow decision, the court ruled that while the typo was unfortunate, the intent was clear enough that the statute remained valid. But this case spawned numerous other cases where typos actually did invalidate laws or regulations. In one famous case, a misspelled word in a hunting regulation meant that thousands of tickets had to be dismissed because the regulation was technically unenforceable. These kinds of typo-based loopholes seem absurd, but they highlight a critical truth about our legal system. The exact wording matters. One letter can be the difference between a valid prosecution and a complete dismissal. So what do all these cases teach us about the American legal system? The truth is, our laws are only as good as their precision. Loopholes exist because human beings write laws, and human beings make mistakes. Typos, vague language, unintended consequences. Some argue that exploiting loopholes is a sign of a brilliant legal mind. Others say it's an exploitation of a system that should protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The reality is somewhere in between. Loopholes have freed innocent people who were convicted based on illegally obtained evidence. They've also allowed guilty parties to escape justice on technical grounds that have nothing to do with their actual innocence or guilt. The question isn't whether loopholes should exist. They're an inevitable feature of any legal system made of words. The question is whether we should work harder to close them. Some argue that strict interpretation of laws protects our freedoms by forcing government to follow the rules exactly. Others argue that it allows criminals to escape justice on ridiculous technicalities. What do you think? Should courts strictly interpret laws, or should they consider the intent behind them? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, subscribe to the Verdict Room for more legal breakdowns that will make you question everything about our justice system. Because in the law, sometimes the craziest stories are the ones that are actually true.